This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. This episode was recorded April 15th, 2020. In this episode, James and I discuss Hypermedia and Hypermedia as the engine of application state.
I put in the meeting notes, maybe talking about hate OS. I don't know how you pronounce it.
Who knows, right? Acronyms.
But I'm thinking like maybe bigger picture, like maybe just throwing around some, just talking about more of the general problems. And I'm thinking we had talked about this already before. We didn't record that conversation. I think this was after we had a recording, talked about it. But just kind of these problems when you have some kind of functionality in a system, but you're going to need to expose that to multiple clients. So for example, you have something I'm working on right now is this form. It's complex enough that so we're going to need this form on the website, and I'm actually like redoing this piece on the web platform, I guess. I'm also building a mobile app that we need the same functionality. We need like the exact same logic as far as the flow of that form goes and validation and stuff like that. But then there's potentially, like in the future, I'll be exposing that as part of the API for the mobile app. So then in the future, there's a possibility of actually exposing that same functionality just as an API that people can say this form is for like booking something, or they can just say, here's my payload. I want to book, or potentially actually have the ability to like walk through the steps of that process without the UI. So, I mean, you think of that, there's potentially like 4 or 5 different scenarios, give or take, where you typically, if you're going to build a UI, a lot of it seems pretty typical that developers embed a lot of business logic, which they don't realize is business logic, into the UI
Workflow.
Yeah. So if I'm booking like a hotel reservation or whatever, a flight or whatever, and I say, okay, I'm starting at Toronto and I want to fly to Vancouver. Now that gives me the ability to choose what days I want to book for, and then as kind of that flow. But then if you go back and I say, okay, actually I'm not going to go to Vancouver, I'm going to go to Montreal. Now those questions like, okay, do I invalidate everything else I just did, because we kind of have to start the process over up to that step. So yeah, a lot of that logic is just like hard coded into UIs. I mean, you might have an API, but you might have like dozens of endpoints, or you have to know which endpoint to call after which. And
See, that it's interesting, because so when we were talking about this, I think you elaborated on it, some of the scenarios a lot better than what we were originally talking about. Not recording, but but you're alluding to it, which is kind of workflow, state, and that the last thing you just said is the thing that really is that's the question I always pose people. And I don't.
What was the last thing I said?
You're asking about like developers. Okay, you got like 12 different endpoints or routes just over this HTTP API, and you need to understand what one you're calling when.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a temporal aspect to this, and you need to have that documented, and that's great for things like OpenAPI, being able to document, okay, here's the different routes that are available. Here's, because they're exposing data or behaviors or whatever the case may be. And you can define all what those HTTP semantics are you know what I mean, for any particular route, like what the HTTP method is, what the payload may be, what the response is going to look like, those schemas, all that goodness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you still need to know as a developer when you're writing that client code, especially if there's state involved and workflow involved, that you need to do this, then you need to do this, etc. And like the response from this is used for this. There's a lot of knowledge that you're putting into the client. Yeah. So when you were alluding to at the very beginning, well, okay, like if I have a normal say a web-based client, and then I have like this mobile app client that are doing pretty much the exact same thing, you're re-putting in that logic of that, like those state transitions of like where to go after what.
Yeah.
In the developer's hands to figure that out. And if it's not the same person doing it, you're remaking that person understand how the API works and those state, like, and how you use the API depending on what the state is. That's the best example of it. Depending on the state, you as the developer, when you're writing it at like, I guess like programmatic time, when you're building the app, you need to understand, okay, in a given state, here's are the things that I can actually do. Here's the routes that I can actually call. Because maybe potentially they're not all valid depending on what the state you're in, right? So that to me is the biggest benefit of Hypermedia, is being able to tell the client, here's the things you can do. Here's places you can go to see related information. Here's the next place that you want to go to in this transition. Here's the actions that are available to you. And it's not, that to me is the biggest benefit. There's a lot of benefits, but to me that's the biggest one, is if your at depends a lot on the behaviors, and the routes that you want to expose are dependent on conditionally on state, or conditionally on anything. You can provide the client with the affordances, say these are the things that you may be interested in given the state that you're in.
Mm-hmm. So excuse me. So yeah, what, like, for people who maybe have never thought of this or just haven't had to actually implement it, Hate OS, I'll say it, Hate OS, HATEOS. What is it? Hypermedia as the engine of state.
Application state.
Application state, yeah. Basically, what you're saying is, when you return an HTTP response, you've got some links, which is, a list of things where it's like, okay, if you placed an order for something, now you can check out. That might be a link that you can supply, or maybe now you can go back to browse for things, or you can, maybe there'd be an option like fast track your checkout, where it's like a single click checkout, where you just click a button and you check out, and all your your default payment method is used, and default shipping address and all that. So I think the next question people would probably have is like, how do you attach that to like a UI? Is probably one question. For example, if you have an action that says like, here's the link to go to checkout, obviously there has to be some understanding, and the UI has to understand at some level, like, there's going to be a link, and that link is attached to maybe a specific button. And then another question is, you had mentioned this, like, you used the like specific example of, I do an action, I get some kind of response, and now I might have like 3 different options, like 3 different actions I can take at this point that are valid. But maybe some of those actually require that state that was returned to me. Maybe that you need to actually pass that state up through to one of those, and that's kind of like that brings up another question I have. Maybe I'll pose it to you later.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, so how do you use it as a client? So, like, to backtrack a little bit farther, when you're using the example of, like, say, like e-commerce, and you have a shopping cart or something, visually, imagine you're on some whatever shopping cart page and you're looking at what you've added to your shopping cart, right? And then you got the picture of an item, its description, all that good stuff. Maybe you got a input box, that's the quantity, and you can increase that quantity, you know what I mean, to whatever the heck you want, because you want to buy more than one of those things.
I know you cut out.
Well, the interesting thing with something like Hypermedia is you may have instead of having an overall update cart where you can change all, so you had 5 products in your basket, maybe you have an update per item, right? And what happens if there's logic built around whether you actually can buy more than one quantity of a given product? Where would that logic live? Well, it would exist on the server, obviously. But if you're providing the client per item its relative action to saying, hey, this route is where you update the quantity. This is how you update the quantity. If you're not providing that link to the client for that item, then they know if this is non-existent, I can't do this because there's no way to do it. Right? So you can start conditionally showing and not showing content on the page solely based on what's there or not there, like from the response that you're getting from the server.
Okay, I cut out for probably about 10 seconds there. Oh. But I can kind of get what you're saying now is, depending on those links that you get, you can conditionally show
stuff. I mean,
things.
The way I always put this is like, maybe this is hard depending on how long people have been doing this for, but if you're pre-spa and you're or have been doing web apps for long enough where you remember, which I think actually is going to come back, more server-side rendering, what would you do? You would do the exact same thing. In your templated HTML, right, you would have conditionals there saying, okay, well, if a certain condition is met, then I can show this button, or I can't show this button, or maybe I show it disabled with some tooltip saying why they can't do something. You'd be doing the exact same thing anyways.
Yeah.
But now we've decided to say, hey, here's all this data, and client, you figure out based on the state what you can and can't do.
Yeah. It seems like, and that's the problem, is I think it's split things up in people's minds now, or in the mind of the industry, I guess, is that if you're displaying data, then you're just displaying data. Like, let the client handle it. If you're actually going to like do something that affects the system, or if you need to do some business logic, put it on the server. But it's like, it's not, you can't actually split it up like that, because some display logic is business logic. If you let a user like choose things in the wrong order and you end up getting into like an inconsistent state, like those are business rules. Even if you're not able to, let's say, persist that inconsistent or corrupted data to a database, there's still business rules so that the customers can actually use the system. Like, it makes sense to use it. I mean, it would be kind of silly if you're like on Amazon and you can try to check out before you have items, and then you get like errors, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to do stuff like that.
Yeah, and in the flow of that, right, is that the server will be deciding, okay, depending on the state that you're in, these are the actual things that you can do. And the client is more so reacting to what, not in terms of like data elements it's going to show, but what actions via however you want to structure these links about where you can navigate from that, that you can do. Another example is I just keep going back to thinking about just good old regular HTML. It's like your browser is a hypermedia client. It's a very generic one that understands just HTML, right? But when there's links, you can click on them and you navigate to that other place, right? So when you, as a static HTML person creating these things, right, if you want the user to be able to navigate, when I'm writing a blog post and I want something to be able to navigate to a relevant other post, I create a link. And there's these other crazy ideas of forms where, you know what I mean? Your browser renders the HTML based on a form saying, oh, there's the inputs. And your form action is the URI to where that post call or whatever the method is going to make to an HTML post, right? Like your browser is a super generic hypermedia client.
Yeah.
Right now, that's not to say that the client that you make in your web app that's handling these, these links from the response from the HTTP, it doesn't need to be generic. Obviously, like you're gonna know, okay, well, this response from this, like you could still be using something like Open API to say, hey, this is what the response is gonna look like, but this collection of links or actions or whatever is gonna be a part of that payload, some of these may not exist, and if they don't exist, then clearly that is not available to me at that time.
Yeah. So in this case, you would basically tie whether an item exists or like an action in this collection exists, tie that to drive the visibility of controls, for example. In some cases, you might want to disable them, I guess. Like you can, like you're saying, like there is some level of like display related logic in the UI, which makes sense because if you're using like Vue.js or React or maybe like an Android client, how you like show a control or disable a control or whatever is different. But at least you can drive that behavior with one code base, and you don't have to duplicate that logic everywhere. And it's funny. I mean, you talk like you're talking about like, let's go back to like pre-SPA and all that. And I know ASP Web Forms gets a lot of flack, and I give it a lot of flack, and I never want to write web forms ever again. That being said, it's not like let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like you can see that I guess for those who aren't familiar with web forms, it's basically you have like an HTML form, but then you also have this other file that's C#, and in C# you can change controls like HTML controls, which they're kind of like these augmented controls that have additional properties and things. So you can do things like, I'm going to get some data from a database query and then load it into this select drop down. And then you have event handlers. Like it looks like you're actually doing the logic in one place. It looks like you're doing the logic on the client, sort of, but you're not. There's mechanisms to like, pass those event handlers from the client up to the server, and very similar to like what we're talking about. Kind of rebuild puts your state back at where it was, and now it's going to apply the event that the user wanted to do. So that whole workflow is very similar to what we're talking about. It's just kind of, there's no separation between the data model and the client. It's just, in this case, it's just all tied together and it's all coupled together. That's where that technology, I think, I don't want to say failed, but when you think of the idea of like the pit of success, where it's just like the usability of a tool, it should just kind of lead people in the right direction. I think web forms, it doesn't do that. It's like, all right, let's just grab some data from a database and throw it into this control, and anytime you want to like click a button, you have to load the whole state of the whole entire page back to your server. But yeah, that idea of having having some state, some piece of data that drives your UI.
Yep.
But yeah, I think it's like people have gone kind of way to the other side of things, especially with MVC. Maybe I don't know if that's what happened, where it was like we were doing things that way, and now we kind of shifted to the other side of the spectrum. Definitely like you're talking about with SPAs. Now we're just like throwing data at clients and like client, okay, you've got to figure everything out.
Exactly. It's like you client, you got to figure it out. Which
Yeah.
is the question I always have that with that to people related to client, you got to figure it out is I ask people, does your app have some level of permit? Like, does it have permissions? Does it have different various authorization roles? Just of that nature. And then if it does, then when a user's logged into the system, how, if you're like, again, if you're creating a spa and you have HTTP APIs on the front end, how are you determining what they can and cannot do? Like visually, like, do you just show everything as if they can do everything? And then when they try to do something and you make that call to the server and then the server throws up saying, hey, no, you can't do that? Or like, how do you conditionally show parts of the system that they can or cannot access? That's generally my question. Like, how do people do that? Because to me, it almost seems completely foreign without what I'm referring to. It's like the server telling the client specifically what they can and cannot do. Like, I've been doing this for 5 years. That's the only way I can think of it at this point.
Well,
is the server driving the client.
I've seen cases, which in my experience is actually more common, which is sad, where you'll get a user model, put it on the client, and this, I mean, it's just JSON data ultimately, has some property that's like, are you an administrator? True.
Yeah, exactly. That's the only way I can possibly think of it. Like, how else would you possibly do that? Then you're doing, again, and that's logic that you're deciding, okay, like, is it just, maybe it's very simplistic, okay, that we know that. But then what happens when that rule changes, which is always the case? I mean, having these validation rules in two places, which is a whole different discussion, is just, okay, we allow, or there's more fine-grained, maybe a new role, some different access levels created to capture one specific action, and then the server's obviously going to implement that, and now the client has to.
Yeah, and you end up with these horrendous conditionals on the client, where it's like, are you an admin, or do you have this other permission?
Yeah.
Or are you viewing your own resource? Are you the user that you're doing this thing for? Or blah blah blah. Like, and then it's like, oh.
Yeah, I do think, like, when we talk about that too, and this isn't so much about hypermedia, but it is a thing related to HTTP APIs, and we were talking to Nate about GraphQL, is like, if there is, if you're using, to me, like, in either or scenario, I pretty much feel like, just providing the client with like more useful information about what they can and cannot do is really helpful. But regardless of what you're doing, the enabler for me, a big one, is there's two things. Is one, that routes are like URIs are not fixed. So I often see questions like on Twitter and stuff about, okay, REST people or HTTP API people, two different things, but what is the proper way to construct a URI? And my answer is, who cares? Because if you're using Hypermedia, the URI it's opaque.
Yeah.
You do not even, you're not constructing URIs. So you're not looking at documentation saying, oh, well, I want to call the change address for customer ID, whatever. And you're like, okay, so then the URI is going to be /customer / and then I'm going to pop in my ID of the customer that I've pulled down, and then their address, I'm going to do a put to that or something. Like, you're not even thinking about that. Like, the URI, you're not constructing URIs. URIs are, again, being passed down from the client. What you do care about, and what is static and that the server cannot change on you, is how you identify that URI. So you're going to have, like, just like you would with like in HTML, if you had like a link, maybe you have some ID property. If you're passing JSON down of, say, an array of collection of links, maybe that thing looks like you have a property called a rel, and that value, that string, that's going to be the thing that clients are looking for, right? That's the thing that's going to say like change customer address or something of that nature. But the URI, like the actual href that you might apply with that, the client doesn't like, it cares about it to use it, but what that thing is from request to request is irrelevant to it.
Yeah,
And the beauty with that, when we were talking about like the benefit for me that has been from that is, one, you don't get in the discussion is, oh, how do I construct a URI and what's our standard here? Two is, depending on where that thing lives and whether you get that right or where that needs to change over time, can change.
mm-hmm.
Right? Because you can change, oh, we're going to move this resource from this service to this service, or from this route to this route, wherever the case may be, and you can do that.
Yeah, it's like versioning is one example I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it's ultimately it's a way to and then to me it's I always say, my question is like related to versioning and HTTP versioning is just don't. It's kind of like event versioning in a kind of a similar way, which is you can augment a resource, like meaning you can add data, right, to what the result is that from that HTTP API. And if you really need to drastically, like you need to make a breaking change to it, then wherever people navigate to that route from, provide the new one,
mm-hmm.
right? And deprecate the old one. Have some meaningful way that in your API you can say, okay, this API, like this, we're still providing this link to you, to this old deprecated API, but as of X, it's going away.
So in this case, you like implementation wise, what you're saying is, let's say you have a link to do some action, and now there's a new way to do it. You wouldn't replace that one. You would keep it. You would add the new one, and then tell your users somehow in documentation or whatever that, hey, you need to start using this other one. But for a while, you're going to have access to both of those same actions, and then eventually remove.
Yeah, like assuming it's actually not backwards compatible.
Yeah.
Assuming like maybe if it's say it's just a get query, but like the actual structure is going to be drastically different, then yeah, you're going to have a completely different resource with a completely different link that you're going to pass down.
But then the other side
start using that.
But then the other, like you're saying, the other side's true, where it's easy to change that. If you do need to change where that's routing to, maybe for some reason, like different parts of your API now are like segmented to different subdomains.
Sure.
Right, something like that, where it's like shipping dot whatever, billing dot whatever, and yeah, you can do that.
If it's a physical location change, then yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so that's really, and then not only that doesn't apply to the one client. If you've got 20 different clients, mobile apps, web apps, public API, consumers, whatever, everybody just gets the change when they do, like ask for that information next time, and it's like easy
and
peasy.
Obviously you can keep track, like with metrics and other things, about when people stop using that other route.
Yeah, I think probably what happens, like the company I'm working in right now, pretty much everything I'm doing right now is related somehow to a new mobile app that they want to build, or that I've been helping build for like the last year. The problem is their existing system is like a system of systems. There's multiple legacy applications that we need functionality from all of these different systems. So there's a lot of refactoring that's kind of has to be done now, because there was never any consideration of like this kind of stuff. Like some logic is in one system, and then you get this same issue where it's like a lot of business logic that we need is like split up. Some of it's on the client, some of it's in the back end, and it's like we need all of that logic in this system. We also need all of that logic in new systems we're building. and in potential future clients. And then that goes for like multiple systems. So I think, yeah, it's like, it's hard. Like, well, it seems hard to do things right the first time. I would say doing it this way is the right way, especially if you can say there's there's some potential of having a mobile app or API or some other thing in the future. Um, and even then, I would still probably say use this approach anyways, because then you get into the case where you've ended up just spreading your logic all over the place. Now the business is like, yeah, we want a mobile app. Okay, we've got like 10 years of hacking away, and now like the cost of bringing all that back in. Or I mean, like we're talking about, the other option is to just duplicate all that logic again. But why waste? I mean, again, it's like a huge maintenance burden, huge potential for missing certain scenarios or different flows. So now, yeah, you've got to examine like the existing flow, bring all that code back into a central location or as much as you can. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now. And it's a lot of work. Like,
Yeah.
it's a huge amount of work. If it would have just been done, say, the right way, I mean, it would have been done
Arguably.
yeah, like, in some ways in this kind of way, or closer to this approach, the better. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that people are just, I mean, design's hard, right? And especially it's hard to get experience designing things. I think a lot of times, I know, like for myself, I was fortunate to be put on projects where I did have the opportunity to kind of flex my design muscles, so to speak, and have the
Yeah.
opportunity to do that. A lot of people just don't have the opportunities to do those kinds of projects.
Yeah, you got to
But
be
yeah,
cutting your teeth somewhere to do these things. Like, it's easy to kind of read stuff or hear stuff, but I don't know. For me, it's always been, yeah, getting, unfortunately, in bad scenarios to then to get to where you need to be. Like,
yeah,
you got to do things wrong a little bit.
yeah, and that plays into like culture and stuff, and it's like, if you can be at a company where it's okay if you do something wrong, and there's the flexibility to, okay, let's change how we're doing this, and we have the ability to do that, as opposed to, oh, I want you to build a prototype. Here's my prototype. All right, production.
Production.
Let's push it to production. And oh no, what are we
Yeah.
doing? I think that's more common.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I got kind of in this mode of doing this in the project that I'm in was, I guess, exactly that reason, which was, it wasn't that at the time we had multiple clients or anything like that. It was more of, because I think there was this realization to me that, like, I'm going to make an HTTP API that behaves, and I'm going to think of it the same way as if I was doing server side stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of just the thought process I had. And I think the other piece of that puzzle too was, at the time when I started working on this, there was just myself and somebody else, and we were kind of split up between front end and back end. And that's just kind of had naturally how this came was, okay, well, we like to coordinate, you know what I mean? If I'm doing the server side stuff, to coordinate what users can and can't do, when I was mentioning like permissions and stuff, that was the first thing that kind of came up, was because we had a lot of it. It's like, okay, there's different roles and there's different permissions and overrides and stuff like this. You know what I mean? Probably every other system that has, that's big enough has this. It's how do we relay all this information?
Yeah.
And again, and then the second piece, which we already talked about, is just state transitions. And the core part of the system I work in transportation is state transitions. So it just seemed natural to relay that down to the client, that that's what we were doing.
Yeah, and then there's I think just the issue of testability alone should push you in this direction. Because yeah, it's like if you put all that state transition logic in the client, now you've got to run these really, really heavy integration tests. It's like Selenium or whatever.
Yeah.
Like they take like all night to run, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you take the approach you're talking about, you can test just like really fast, hit this endpoint, make sure I'm allowed to do these things.
Yeah.
Okay. Like that's your test is done and it's super quick.
Yeah, I think the other thing too that I kind of hear about, or I get, or seems to be a lot of questions is around tooling, or like you were kind of alluding to it, like how do clients use it? And I hope we've talked about it a little bit enough to maybe people can get a guess at what the tooling scenario is, which is there's nothing to like there isn't anything.
Yeah, it's not, like a patterning kind
of,
right?
there's no like I don't need to like generate code from an open API spec, or like there's like you can still use open API with kind of this method, like you can still document, like it's not one or the other.
Yeah,
it's just that you still need to know, okay, this route does this, right? Or and this is the schema of what's going to come back, or this is what I got to send. You still need to know all that stuff. Yeah. It's just a knowing when you can go where. So yeah, that question of like, oh, well, the tooling story is terrible for dealing with Hypermedia. It's like, well, there doesn't need to be any.
Yeah.
Now having said that, there are some, like, it depends on I should say this. If you are making what I just described, where you're still writing all the code and you're not using some generic, I guess, client, I will say. And what I mean by that is like I mentioned, a browser is just a generic client that understands HTML. If you have a very specific, I mean, it renders forms, it renders your page, it understands how it does all the rendering. You could go down, I'm not saying you should, you saying you could go down the route if you're using a very specific media type that's kind of built around Hypermedia. You could, because there's a spec for it, you could create your own client that essentially generated whatever you're displaying in, say it's HTML or whatever the heck it is. You could create something that basically, hey, here's what this result looks like, and it has all these fields, and I got this action that I can do this stuff with, and it could build it out for you. Yeah. There's actually, and I'll include links for this, but
I've done something like that in the past, and I'm just going to say it's a headache. Like,
I wouldn't suggest doing it, but to give you the example is that there are ones that do this, and you can like, there's like little sample apps that, the UI looks atrocious, right? Because you're not making it the way you want it to. It's generic, right? But yeah, there's no tooling required. It's like, does this exist in the response or not? And then you decide what you want to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I should say kind of what I've done in the past was for a particular project. It wasn't that generic, but it was generic enough where different, so there's this one system for life insurance, and it's configurable in the sense that other insurance companies would use this as kind of their own system, so white label, their logo shows up, but then they can customize like the whole flow of their particular insurance application, so they can take pieces out. Like, for example, if one part is like medical questions, they could configure like their own medical questions and what happens, and you would say yes or no. But then like some of those forms, one client might only want certain controls, right? So there would be a piece of this configuration that you would have to send. It didn't go to the client, but it went to the server to render the controls, and basically based on that configuration, you have to figure out, I'm going to show a button here, and it's got this text, and those kinds of things. Anyways, I mean...
Yeah, it's like a dynamic form builder thing based off of the schema same idea, yeah.
Yeah, so I can see like people who are thinking about like where that'd be useful, like even... like we're talking about different clients, but in a sense, those logically are different clients in a sense, right? Like when you're accessing the system, depending on configuration, you might actually want to give them, I guess it's like permissions, right? Permissions is a configuration where you want to show different things to them depending on how they're configured. But I have another question to throw out. What are your thoughts on, let's say we have a flow where I get some data and I can make a decision based on that data, and then I have a link to say here's the route for when you make do that action. So then I go out there, now I do something different. So you kind of have step 1, step 2, step 3. Have you ever heard about or considered or done that, but done it more, treated as like a state machine itself, like in the back end? So you might only have like 1 or 2 endpoints, which is kind of very similar to like view state in ASP, where you're basically saying, here, client, here's some data, here's some state. Okay, you've done something. Now let's load what you've done so far back to the server. Now we can kind of check based on, it's like a session basically, on what you've done. Now we can verify, okay, here's the next thing you can do. I'm going to give you kind of the next, where the state's at now and what you can do next. So it's kind of similar, but instead of actually hitting different endpoints, you might be hitting the same endpoint, but you might be doing like different actions.
Yeah, somewhat.
Which I guess like the endpoints themselves could actually call the same code, which in the back end would be just this like big, or there'd just be like this generic state machine or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess you could still do it that way, but.
Yeah, pretty well. A lot, actually.
Okay.
It's because, like I said, the core part of what we do is, it's a truck driving down a road that picks up freight from one place, right? Whoever, and like there's various events. There's different states that goes through, right? So it's them arriving, them loading the freight, them departing, them driving down the road, right? And then we have getting what we call position updates from that truck driving down the highway to know where they're at, and then the cycle continues. Like arrive, maybe you're loading more freight, maybe you're emptying freight, like you're unloading it. So like the way the data looks for the most part through all these things is very similar to each other, but it changes a little bit depending on what the state of that shipment is going through, like where it is at in this, like in the process of that shipment. Okay. So when you're saying like going to the same route, they're not the same route, but for all intents and purposes, they probably could be. And again, the client wouldn't be any wiser that they are or aren't.
So basically, you're just saying this route. Let's say truck arrived at destination is like an event. So you would have a link that's like, here's the route for when you arrive.
Correct. Yep.
You probably wouldn't click it, but it would be triggered somehow. Okay, we're gonna, go send a post request to this URL. Truck arrived. But then in that code for that with essentially an event handler or like a message handler, basically, like semantically, you're saying the actual like method in your code for that route would be like handle truck arrived.
Correct. Yep.
But then you probably like we were talking about, you'd have the same kind of class or whatever, the same kind of like mini system in the back end, where now you're saying, okay, this is a different route, but now I'm going to bring the same class up, and I'm going to say, okay, here's the truck arrived command. I'm going to give you a command, truck arrived, or whatever. Whereas now, if there's like the next step is maybe you get a new destination that you need to drive to or whatever, that would be a different URL, a different route. But then in the back end, you'd bring up this same like system and say, okay, here's this new command that I'm issuing. And I think this is probably where people struggle. It's definitely where I struggled, because you like we talk about different endpoints as far as the contract goes to the outside world, but essentially we're doing is like semantically modeling this workflow as different commands or different handlers that ultimately they just use the same like back end thing, right? So you're saying, okay,
Yeah. So yeah, like for us, like say that you're looking at a shipment. When you get that like URL, say, okay, this is how I get shipment data for this particular shipment. That response you get back is going to tell you. So when it hits server, the server is going to do that query saying, okay, for this particular shipment, let's build out how we want to represent the shipment. And then, so obviously like the customer, like the shipper, who you're delivering to, the consignee, all these other things, bills of lading, whatever, all that domain stuff nobody cares about. And then what you have is, for example, depending on state, you will have the arrive. And the arrive will be a command that you can perform on that shipment. When the client goes and does that arrive, right, and provides the payload for what they need to do for the arrive, in that response, we return what the next event is that they can do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like you have to query again. It's like, okay, you did the arrive. A part of your response to that request is the next subsequent set of actions that you can do with the updated version of what that looks like now. Right? So like you're saying, like if you did the arrive, then the next thing is do a load, which is like the pickup, like actually pick up the freight and load it into the vehicle. Like that's the next step. And then there's kind of payload that is required there. Behind the scenes, all of those things are really going into somewhat of the same place, which is because we build all these up as events, and an individual shipment is event sourced, that we rerun all the events to get to where we are to figure out, okay, what's the next thing you can actually do?
Yeah.
And that kind of internal piece is what drives kind of that little state machine of like through the whole shipment. So
would you say, just raising the point of event sourcing, would you say actually using event sourcing makes that much easier? Because typically, no? Okay. Because I'm thinking like, okay.
The reason I say is because we do it, like we don't event source everything. That's really the only thing we do event source is like a shipment. Okay. But we do hypermedia everywhere else based on, again, it's just whether current state is in a table or a document somewhere, like object, or whether you're getting current state via via all the different series of events. It doesn't really change anything because like the actions that you're going to do are based on current state.
Yeah.
Right. So how you got to current state via events or via like event sourcing, I should say, to clarify, or via just you store current state in a database. You're at the same place.
Okay. No. Very cool.
Yeah, it's. I mean, okay. So we should talk before we end this with downsides, because not everything is roses and silver bullets and all this other stuff, right? Yeah. There are downsides to doing this. I would say it's cumbersome to do if you, like, depending on the size of the system that you're doing. This can feel like if the actual HPI that you have is very small, and like I said, the cases in which, let's say you got a dozen different APIs, HTTP routes that you can call, and let's say they're all very, like you can call them, like there's not a lot of use cases about like, depending on the current state, they may not all apply, or there's a state transitions, or you call this one after this one. You know what I mean? Like that, there's not a lot of that going on. Then this is kind of overkill.
Yeah.
Like to put that logic in the client, or like you're going to put it somewhere. So like, do you know what I mean? Like, is it, maybe overkill is not maybe that's the wrong word. It may not be as beneficial to you. So that would be one thing. The other one would be it is
in that case, just going back, maybe if your flow is very predictable.
Yes, that's a good way of putting
like
it. Yeah.
Even if you have 20 steps, which is a lot, let's say, but if you know it's always going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if you're at step 5 and you go back to 3, you just start over at 3 and then you keep going. Whereas I think what we're saying is if that diverges, where maybe you get to 6 and you have the ability to skip to 12, or like just do like
depending on state.
Like you can, it becomes kind of not so sequential, then this would be maybe
that makes
more
sense.
Beneficial.
I would say that. So I can't remember what word you just used, but like predictable. I don't know what you said, but that would be good. The other one would be I always use the word evolvable, like evolvability, and it's just how long is this what you're creating gonna live? And again, like the system I'm working in, like the intent is obviously like it runs trucking companies, so the hope is that we're running this thing forever, right? Like it's not like it's this, okay, we got to create this app and it's only good for this X period of time, or it's like when we were talking about deprecating routes, or maybe you create a new route, but it's going to be backwards compatible with an old one. But the way it works, how it fetches data behind the scenes is optimized, and you don't want to change the other one. You want people to migrate to the new. Like there's an evolvability to that if that's important to you, then that's really beneficial. Because like a real world example that we just did last week was in our mobile app, we made changes to it so that like the driver on the phone, the app that they have on their phone, when we actually changed where they're hitting. We actually physically changed the route that they're hitting. And we made it backwards compatible depending on what version of the mobile app they're using. So we created a new version of the mobile app that had a different route. And we were like, well, we don't want these two routes that are very similar, right? We have these two HTTP routes that are very similar and they're doing a lot of the same things. We can probably merge these into one. But if you're using the new app, you get these additional things that we kind of weren't backwards compatible. But if you're using the old version still, we'll make everything work the same way still. And we did. And that required no change to the mobile app.
Yeah.
Right? Like everything just still works the same way, but they're actually coming to a completely different route and piece of code that we have in our HTTP API. So like evolvability and being able to do that, because like we do it, it's not a ton we do that, but it's enough where it's mobile app, depending on what you're using, isn't the easiest thing to get people to update and change unless you're using something where you can do that on the fly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's evolvability. And if you don't have that need, then maybe you don't need to do this. Now, having said all that,
I would say if there's ever going to be a case where your users are going to have different versions, using different versions concurrently of your client, which usually doesn't happen with a website because you control that client. You can just, you update and now everybody uses the new version. But with mobile apps, like you have version 2 and I have version 3 and Bob has version 10. This definitely helps with that, because otherwise what do? If you're going to change the API, you break it for all the previous versions. How do you then? I think that's where you get into these like people talking about how do you version APIs and blah blah blah. And it, this is kind of maybe just a more straightforward approach, right?
Yeah, and I would say I guess the last thing I'll add to this is, because I've heard this quite a bit, and I don't really understand it, is that it's difficult, like that there's some like it's hard. It's very difficult to create an HTTP API that returns links and actions to the client, and you're doing this anyways. People have to think about this.
Yeah, just take what you're doing in JavaScript
and move it over.
Move it over, even if you're doing it in like your controller route. It's better.
Move it over, because I guess the idea there again being is that, especially if it relates to state and you're putting these conditional lock, like you got to put these conditions in somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's, where do you want them to be? Do you want them to be in the client? And maybe you do want them in the client. Like that's, I don't know. Like that's, I can say in my situations, no, I do not want them in the client because there's many of them.
Yeah.
And I have to have it in the server. So I would rather it in one place on the server and have the condition on whether something exists or not a condition on what the structure of the data looks like. And well, if this field says this, like you said, like if the user or is it a min and they have this, or if you're looking at the state of a shipment saying, okay, well, if it's in, like, how do you determine the state? Is it like these 5 fields determine what state it's in that I could then call this other route? Like that wasn't flying basically for me. So
yeah, I think
you got to do it anyways. Like it's just a matter of,
yeah. Like I think of like, the approach where people might be building like a mobile app or even like just an SPA or a spa.
yeah.
SPA, yeah. I'm tired. Brain fart. I don't even know what I was going to say.
It's all good. I can cut this out.
Yeah. Oh, well. What was I going to say? Oh, man, that's going to bug me.
I was just saying you got to put the logic somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. No. I was going to talk about like, yeah, this, when like Angular first came out and like Vue.js first came out, and probably, around that time, probably even before like React, kind of when these major SPA tooling came around, it seemed like there was this architecture that people really liked doing, which was using, for example, Firebase, which is a Google product, where like in your JavaScript client code, you can just call an API to store a document, for example, like a JSON document. And then there's like a document DB as a service, basically. And then you'd also have identity as a service. So like all your logic's in your client. I mean, obviously the benefit of that is you can iterate really quickly. Like that would be really fast to build. When you're just using HTTP, service for using a cloud service, and you're just doing HTTP requests via like a client that you have to do authorization, identity, and persistence and all that stuff. So in that case, I can kind of see maybe people who are used to building things that way, when you actually get to like I don't want to say those are non-trivial, because I know there are non-trivial apps built that way. But then, yeah, when you do get into the place where now I do have a server and it is complex. I've got some complex domain knowledge and I do have to handle multiple clients. I can see how that approach, which seemed very common, it seemed like it was being pushed in the industry like a lot. Oh, here's the new way to do it. Especially when document DBs first came out, it seemed like this approach was very popular, to just do everything in the client, store everything as JSON documents.
I think what you're alluding to though is maybe that like if you have, like you're doing the client, if you have control, like if you have full control, like say you have server and you have a client and you have full control over them.
Yeah.
And you can make, like if you want to make a breaking change, like you were saying, like, well, then you can just go change the client.
Yeah.
It's more so, I guess, it's really beneficial is if you can't control the client, you can't make those changes very easily.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you like start mixing different clients, like for example, it's not even true. I think mobile apps is just a good example. Like,
yeah, if you cannot change it easily,
yeah,
like you were saying, because of versions and updating and whatever the case may be. Or it's not, like say maybe you have an API where that's public, or you have different partners that you integrate with and they're using that API, like, and you've defined it and here's what it is. Well, you can't break them.
Yeah.
Right. So, or you shouldn't be, but right. Like you don't want to be breaking them. So, how can you evolve your API without, even behind the scenes, right? Like you got this contract saying, okay, this is what the structure is going to look like, but behind the scenes, you want to be able to iterate on stuff. You want to be like how you store things, or whether you're using caches behind the scenes, or just the structure of anything behind what you're outputting to them, where it actually lives physically, like we were saying with changing the URI, like all that's kind of, that evolvability is the benefit. If you don't need all that, yeah, maybe it's.
And again, like I said, I think it does go back to maybe having foresight.
Yeah.
I think, if you haven't done it, it can be kind of like, it's not talked about as much. It seems like when it is talked about, usually I hear actually like bad things about it, like, oh, it's like you had mentioned it's really cumbersome and blah blah, but it's like, well, I don't think it's as cumbersome as what I'm hearing people say. It's like, oh, it's really 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 cumbersome. I don't think it's that cumbersome. It's just, okay, you actually have to step back and maybe actually think about designing this business process. That's probably because a lot of times you don't. You're just going to hack things together, and it's the way you were told to build this, as opposed to, okay, let's actually map out the states and what possible transitions can occur between them, and I'll actually use that as a model for what my API does, right? So it's like those extra steps you have to think about and maybe design separately. And that's kind of where I'm at now, is this process that I'm trying to refactor, I guess, but I am kind of redoing it. But the actual like business process is not documented anywhere, so that's kind of a piece of what I have to do, is use the system and diagram out, like, here's where I am, step 1, step 2, step 3, and here are the different actions you can do at each state, where they jump back to. So, I mean, the benefit of thinking about it that way too is you can document it, right? So that's kind of a nice. And I've seen there must be, I don't know, like we talked about tooling, I wonder if there would be a tool that you could say, okay, here's my first endpoint, and it would just automatically like play through all the different scenarios, so it'll get a response. Yeah, because you still kind of have to know a bit about like the payloads for your.
Yeah, you do
routes.
A little bit. I will say, when you start doing this, like we use, which a lot of people probably use, Postman, and when I'm developing stuff at first, before I even create the client, I'm really just in Postman. And because in Postman, I see the link, and in Postman, you can click the link and it adds a new tab, and guess what? I hit send. And there's a little checkbox setting to copy like authorization information. So it copies my header over, and I can literally in Postman navigate the API.
Yeah.
Just clicking around links, basically. Like you can just click around, and the little section I'm in, I can just start at one specific spot, and then I can just do what I need to do.
Yeah.
And just use Postman as the client.
Yeah, and that's cool because you can record those like sessions as a test, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see, okay, I do this, then this link's available, then I click this one's available. And you can kind of, it's almost like, it's you could create a real, like for our API, you could create essentially like a crawler. Really, you just crawl on, look at the links, and do what it needs to do.
Yeah, and that's a big benefit. If you put that extra work up front, then it's like those things, like being able to test this logic becomes much easier, and versioning and blah blah blah. All that stuff is much easier.
Yeah. Cool.
We'll do the
Hypermedia.
2-second pause.
Hypermedia 101.
Yeah, that's cool.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.